Okay, so we're carrying on with our annotation of A Christmas Carol. We're still on Stave 4 and we're on page 42. I'm about halfway down, so if I zoom out so you can see, we're about halfway down page 42. We're going to carry on making our notes. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried but in vain to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to dinner that had been holding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. "Is it good," she said, "or bad?" To help him. "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined?" "No, there is hope yet, Caroline." "If he relents," she said amazingly, "there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened." "He is past relenting," said her husband. "He is dead." She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment, and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. Now this is the sixth thing that the Ghost of Christmas Future has shown to Scrooge, and it's this couple that owe Scrooge money. And this has come from what we looked at just before, where it says, "If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death," said Scrooge, quite agonized, "show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you." So if we just turn back to the previous page, the last thing, the fifth thing that the Ghost of Christmas Future shows Scrooge is his own death, but Scrooge doesn't realise it's his own death. And nobody seems to care about the fact that he's died. And so in response to that, Scrooge says this line. He wants to see some emotion. Now, what we see is a couple who are very affected by being in debt. This is the effect of debt that we can see here. She's anxious. She's sort of pacing up and down. She can't bear the voices of her children. She's trying, but she's in vain, working with her needle, so she can't do it. And he is careworn and depressed and feeling sort of ashamed. So this is the effect Dickens is showing us of debt on a family. And remember, he would have known that really well because his own father went to debtor's prison. So we can see that this would be really important for him to convey this idea of what it means to be have money worries. Now the man, when he comes in, has a kind of serious delight, but he also feels ashamed. And this is because he feels guilty because he knows he's going to benefit from Scrooge's death. So he says that when she says, "Is it good or bad?" that it's bad because Scrooge is dead. So ultimately he knows that is a bad thing. But actually the reality is that they feel happy about it. She feels relief. She is thankful in her soul to hear it. So she feels relief. But then straight away afterwards, she prays for forgiveness. She feels guilty for sort of thinking happy thoughts about the fact that a man has died. Now, Scrooge asked, and that's why we've got this dotted line here, Scrooge asked to see some emotion caused by this man's death. And what he was really expecting to see was some sort of sadness or some grief. But the emotion that we actually see is one of relief. So you might want to note here, Scrooge asked to see emotion, and what he sees is relief, not sadness or grief, which is what he was expecting to see. And this is really shocking for Scrooge, but obviously also for the reader as well, that really nobody misses Scrooge at all. Or maybe we're not that shocked, but Scrooge certainly is. And then it carries on page 43. "What the half-drunken woman I told you of last night said to me when I turned to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline." So they're not getting rid of their debt, they've still got to pay it back, but they've realised that they've got time and they can be ready with the money, so they don't have this kind of pressure on them. Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter. It was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. And that's the end of that vignette, that scene from the future that we get. The fact that actually they all feel relief, they have got lighter hearts, the children's faces are brighter, and the house is happier. So then Scrooge then says, "Let me see some tenderness connected with a death," said Scrooge, "or that dark chamber spirit which we left just now will be forever present in me." So we know now that we're not going to see his death, we're going to see a death, any death with some tenderness connected. And the death that we're going to see now, again, is in the future. So this is the 7th thing that the Ghost of Christmas Future shows to Scrooge, and it is Tiny Tim's death. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet. Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And here we see this repetition of quiet, very quiet, quiet, and them being as still as statues. And this repetition of the word quiet and this stillness is a real contrast to the Cratchit family on Christmas Day, where it was full of activity and full of noise and action. "And he took a child and set him in the midst of them." Where had Scrooge heard these words? He had not dreamt them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? So this is a line from the Bible about God sending his son Jesus and putting him in the midst of the people in order to that we be forgiven and of our sins. So there's a real connection here that just like God sent his son Jesus, Tiny Tim is then linked to this idea of a kind of Jesus Christ child figure who brings hope for people, and that's what Jesus provided for the world. And with his death, with Jesus's death, people's sins were kind of wiped away if they asked for forgiveness. But here we see Tiny Tim almost being a sacrifice for Scrooge's sins. And if Scrooge asks for forgiveness, then Tiny Tim will be spared. Where had Scrooge heard these words? He had not dreamt them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The colour hurts my eyes," she said. "The colour? Ah, poor Tiny Tim." "They're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time." "Past it, rather," Peter answered, shutting up his book. "But I think he has walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, mother." They were quiet again. At last she said, in a steady and cheerful voice that only faltered once, I've known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed." "And so have I," cried Peter. "Often." "And so have I," exclaimed another. So had all. "But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work. "And his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. There is your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. So here we see the mum being very strong for the dad, Bob. She doesn't want to show her weak eye. She's trying to be strong for him, and we get this sense of them as a family, as a unit, supporting each other. And again, that just highlights what Scrooge is lacking. He doesn't belong to anyone. There's no sense of belonging to a family here. And we also see a little hint of Bob's grief and his struggle and his sadness, that he's sort of walking slower. But really this bit here is filled with a love and a nostalgia and memories of Tiny Tim, and this way that they sort of share them, this shared experience, again, relates to this idea of them being a unit, this idea of togetherness, as opposed to Scrooge's own isolation and kind of outsider status. And then she hurries out to meet him, and the children all rush around to see who can help him most. And again, we get this sense of kindness, of care and love and tenderness, and this sense of family again, that they're in this together. And that is what is really important about this scene. Okay, so then if we turn into page 44, it continues. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child," cried Rob. "My little child." So again, we've got this place being very green. This is where he's buried. And that compares to the graveyard that we're going to see in the next on the next page. So if I put compare to Scrooge's graveyard, whereas this kind of idea of green, sort of suggesting nature and life, even in death, is really important. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been further apart perhaps than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. So Tiny Tim's body is still in the house. He's sort of in the bed, and this would be often what happened so that people could visit the body and say their goodbyes before it was taken away and put in a coffin. But we see that the room is decorated with Christmas. So we've got this sense that they're almost celebrating his life. There's a chair next to the bed and signs that someone has been there. So he's not alone, and that he's got Bob there next to him. So I think there's important comparisons that we can make here with Tiny Tim's deathbed and Scrooge's deathbed. And what's interesting is that at the end, it says that Cratchit was reconciled to accept what had happened. So he accepts this, and he can accept that because of his faith. That provides him with a comfort, that he knows that Tiny Tim has gone to a better place. And I guess he can also accept it because he knows that Tiny Tim lived a good and fulfilling life, even though his life was short. And that's why Scrooge can't really accept what has happened to him, because that realization that he has misspent his life and wasted his life focusing on the wrong things. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mothers working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he'd scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. On which, said Bob, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him. "I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit," he said, "and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know." "Knew what, my dear?" "Why, that you were a good wife," replied Bob. "Everybody knows that," said Peter. So despite what's happening to them, they're still almost able to have a little joke about how Fred knew that Bob's wife was a good wife. "Very well observed, my boy," cried Bob. "I hope they do. Heartily sorry," he said, "for your good wife. If I can be of any service to you in any way," he said, giving me his card, "that's where I live. Pray come to me." "Now it wasn't," cried Bob, "for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he'd known our Tiny Tim and felt with us." "I'm sure he's a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "You would be sure of it, my dear," returned Bob, "if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say. if he got Peter a better situation. So here we see this idea that Fred might use his status to do good deeds, to help Peter out, get a better job. So sort of, again, this helping a family in a time of need, and using his power and influence to help others. And so this Fred's reaction to Tiny Tim's death is full of kindness, and it's really important that we recognise that. "Only hear that, Peter," said Mrs. Cratchit. "And then," cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself." "Get along with you," retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob. "One of these days there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us." "Never, father," cried they all. "And I know," said Bob, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves, and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it." "Never, father," they all cried again. "I am very happy," said little Bob. "I am very happy." Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, her daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God. So really this is just saying that he was a gift from God, and this bit that we've picked out here, they're going to sort of hold on to the memories of Tiny Tim. Even though he's dead, they're going to look for the good, and they're saying that they're going to sort of take this experience and make sure they use it not to fight with each other, and be sort of a loving and close family. They're not going to quarrel, meaning they're not going to fall out with one another. Okay, let's stop there for this one then.